Well, I want to thank you all so much. This has been a great panel, all of us. I think we're going to transition now to questions from the audience. I think we can also have a way to take questions from the live stream. So any questions for any of the group that is up here? And we'll see if there are any. If there aren't, I'll throw out one. Oh, we have one. Great. I think there are mics moving around.
Question for Dr. Blendon. How, for the purposes of your research, define rural, and do you have a single definition?
You obviously know that there's 7 definitions that exist. You can go from one federal government website to the other and have a different. So we were very simple. We just took non-metropolitan areas for that. It also is what the national exit poll does when everybody says how rural voters for it. It was the simplest, but there are very more complex definitions that you can move. But we just took non-metropolitan areas for that. But those of you who work in the field, I was floored how many papers on rural America, and the geography is not even the same. It would help if somebody gets to Washington someday and just agree so we can follow this together, because it is very confusing for people.
I think we have a question over here.
Sure, yeah. Thanks for a wonderful discussion and very informative. You've identified a number of critical problems in rural areas, and you're lifting up a whole variety of solutions, which is wonderful to see. But the challenges that we're all trying to address are not baked into rurality, right? These are created problems. Alonzo spoke at the beginning about structural issues and structural solutions. So many of the problems that you're struggling with are created, for example, the opioid epidemic, by this drive for profits in pharma, or the lack of job opportunities, the way healthcare is distributed, driven by the policies that we choose to adopt as a nation, deregulation, relaxed enforcement around monopolization, and so forth. So as we focus on really meeting the immediate need, which is critical and needs to be addressed, how do we start tackling some of these structural issues that are actually feeding the pipeline to create these immediate needs and challenges?
Jen, Ed?
Yeah, well, we struggle with this. The way I'm hearing you and the way I think about this is we look to make creative investments to disrupt or to add value to places that aren't being seen, and that's partly because rural areas are kind of discussed as if they're a market failure, and they just don't warrant extensions of fiber optics or broadband. They don't warrant another school or another bank. It's this rolling back of these services. So we do try to, invest in creative ways and see where there are opportunities to prove that these pilot projects can work. And also, especially in health and education, and in community development, we really look at framework investment. So a great example from our portfolio, there's 2. One in community development, where we've now been working with 6 states in something called the Appalachian Funders Network, which a small group in Benedum was one, sort of stood up 10 years ago. And now this is a strong network that's all aligning and thinking strategically. And in health, we've done it across the state of West Virginia. In oral health, again, we're looking at this with foster care, with women's health and prenatal strategies, and with opioids. So that's just from the foundation side. We do try to take a framework and a creative look at things.
That's a great question. No, I'm good. No, thank you for your question. When we look at a number of the stories that I've shared this morning, they were all grounded in local people. And the way I look at that is there ain't nothing wrong in rural America that can't be fixed by what's going right. And so that's where the solutions start. And then we need to make sure the resources are there to fund the solutions. So many of our policies just don't reach. Look at the Community Reinvestment Act in rural communities. If OFN, Opportunity Finance Network, our trade association did an analysis in the difference between Community Reinvestment Act motivated investments by banks in rural communities versus urban communities, and there was a gap. And it's baked into the policy. I mean, if you look at the southeast of the 20 largest banks, only 2 have any assessment area, any responsibility to reinvest in the most distressed rural communities. It's a function of policy. So we need to work on that policy so we can get more bank investment in rural communities. Philanthropy. The National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy did an analysis, and what they found was that, per capita grant making in the Mississippi Delta and in the Alabama Black Belt was $41 per person. In Appalachia, it was $43 per person. In San Francisco, it was $4,100 per person. It's a structural gap. In Native communities, many of which are rural, we saw giving decline from 2006 to 2014 by $35 million. So again, looking at, making sure the resources are in place and that policies are in place to funnel the resources so that we can operationalize the solutions that local people already know how to do.
Do you have any other questions? Oh, in the back and then down in the front.
Tim Merriman from Center for Rural Strategies and the Daily Yonder. And about the polling, one of the things that Alonzo referred to in the opening was that our perceptions about rural America may or may not be correct, and that's one of the things we need to address. And in picking the kind of what's news and what are the highlights of the report on the polling, I was curious how you do that without having a national or an urban sample to compare it to.
It's a very good question. I have reporters who are constantly asking me that question, and I turn to Bob and I say, Bob, what are the national data? How can we compare this? And sometimes there are data and sometimes there are not.
So this is both simple and the answers don't always help. So if I want to really understand life in suburban America, I may have to ask about questions that I wouldn't ask in a city. And, how's it different in New York? But life in suburbia is not the same as New York. So you have all types of questions. So this survey included a lot of things that people just wouldn't ask in lots of urban America. And so distance traveled to see somebody, honestly, is not in New York, it's blocks. So we really wanted to get into people's lives in rural America where there are big distances, where not populations. So you start changing the questions. So it allows it to make sense if I live in a small town. And then the minute you get back, you say, well, how's it in New York, Bob? How's it in New York? Do they have the same problem? So the survey was designed the way we have in many others to give richness to the lives of a particular group of people. But I, too, wish I had the same answer. And every time we got to a question, there is a national question. But somebody would say, it doesn't exactly fit the way we would ask it in rural America. So we changed it. And then we're now in this moment saying, Bob, why didn't you give me national data? And the answer is the national data has to figure out getting to work in San Francisco and getting to work in a tiny town in Mississippi. And it doesn't work very well. So this was designed to give as much richness for people who live in much more isolated areas. For that, it's 12 minutes in an average city to get to an emergency room. We wouldn't have this discussion. So that's why it varies, and my apologies, and we'll go back. But last time we did a national study with them, everybody said, it's not like that in rural America, Bob. Why can't you tell us more about rural America? So it is a tension. I will be the one to absorb the tension for it.
That's why I tossed it to you.
Yes. But it is a dilemma of trying to get in the richness of asking people about their particular life experiences and not having to go, is it the same on Long Island and is it the same across from Cornell Medical Center? So that's why it is different. My apologies, there will be others which will be national. And in this, we actually have a sample of Native Americans living in rural areas, which are really very important. And people, when we did a national survey, which included Native Americans, said, I don't think people in cities have the same life as people in rural Americas. We couldn't answer that. We can now talk about being a Native American in a rural community for it. But you lose the trade-off. How about Native Americans in urban communities? But my apologies for this, but the purpose was to allow people who are in a different circumstance to speak as uniquely as we could. I'm guilty.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think we had a question down here in the front. Oh, a live stream. Sorry, we'll get to you in a moment.
So we have a question from Twitter. When looking at rural data, what are some words of caution for outside interpretation?
You know, my biggest complaint with rural data really comes down to the fact that when you're taking a lot of basic, sort of what we would call like big data sets, the numbers are often so small in certain counties or communities that they show up as blank. The whole county shows up as like insignificant data and not doesn't reach a bar that's high enough to compare it with everything else. So I just think it's a lot of incomplete information, which is why I appreciate what you're doing here, even if you have to defend it on stage.
Yes.
And I would respond again by just continuing to beat the drum about sharing a narrative of rural America that is inclusive. Rural America is not monolithic by any stretch of the imagination, and all the folks in this room will share that with you. And so, you know, the stats that really come out to me, if you look at some of the economic mobility data that has been, you know, put out over the last couple of years by Raj Chetty, there are a lot of rural communities where there is an advantage to growing up in that community in terms of future earnings. However, when you begin to parse out those communities, particularly along race lines, that advantage begins to erode. I shared that analysis with a colleague from Fayette, Mississippi, Jefferson County. That county is 86% black. It's one of the poorest counties in America. And she said, I don't know anyone from Fayette who ever thought they had an advantage. That was her response to it. And again, so that's not to say that there isn't an advantage growing up in rural America. There absolutely are advantages. However, as we describe rural America having a narrative that includes everyone and looks at the nuances and celebrates those, that's one that we need to strive for.
So, ma'am?
Yeah. Mindy Kurzer from the University of Minnesota. I apologize in advance if my question, comment is naive or generalizing, but the question, or the first of all, the comment that I have is that it seems to me that, you know, I agree with the person who said that. Is this, okay. I agree with the previous person who said that when you look at the opioid epidemic, there's lots of causes, including big pharma wanting, you know, more profits, and then the desperate hopelessness that so many young people feel in rural areas and urban areas both, but in rural areas, the economic problems and the loss of family farms. A lot of this due to federal policies that are resulting in some of this and lack of funding for programs that might help. And the sort of paradox of this, which I wonder if any of you have comments on, is that when you look at the voting map of this country, the difference is really urban versus rural. And people in rural areas are not voting to support programs and government policies that would help them out of the problems that they're in. And so maybe you could tell me if I'm kind of generalizing too much or naive, but it seems to me, and I don't know if you think that if we increase the education, if we increase the economy, people will shift their positions on things. But the lack of trust in government that's seen in rural areas, and yet people want government support, to me, there's a contradiction there. And, you know, if you look at our, I mean, we may have differences in opinion in this room, but if you look at our government right now, it is not going to put big money into solving the problems that you're talking about here. And it seems to me that what is required is massive input from the federal government. It's not going to be philanthropic organizations and corporate America that's going to solve these problems. So what do you guys think about that?
I've got a couple of reactions to that. So on the opioid epidemic, yes, there's strong evidence that this has been very predatory, particularly in Appalachia. But I would say, I don't know if it's about just despair. I think that Appalachia and rural America has a lot of very hard physical jobs. Agriculture, manufacturing, mining, you name it. And I just think that people have injuries. And unlike other periods in time, those injuries were treated with a very strong type of pain medication, and a lot of people got addicted to it. And it wasn't out of despair, it was out of shoulder surgery and other back injuries and things that are very natural, especially when you're in a state like West Virginia that's a high manufacturing employment base. But that said, you know, some of the aspects of the voting side, to me, come down to just the culture of pride and the way rural communities turn to each other for help. There's high volunteerism, there's high participation in the military, there's high participation in churches and religious organizations. And if you've lived, you know, I'm sure everyone in this room has lived in rural, that's why you're here, but people still barter, people still help each other out, people still do things for themselves. And I think that's part of this piece where it doesn't kind of flesh out at the voting polls, because it seems like a point of pride that it's not a need for government to step in and give you a handout, because people are very self-sufficient and do a lot on a shoestring. So I think it's partly pride, and that's why it looks different at the polls than what we may see as need and where government could step in and be really helpful. With the opioid epidemic, there's a lot of money coming down from the federal side right now for programs that are related to the opioid epidemic, and then there's these state lawsuits with Big Pharma coming down. I mean, one of the things that I think is going to be a problem that we're seeing, and I've been talking about, is how do we effectively spend, use, implement, deploy, absorb all that money to actually solve the problem, because it's actually coming down in rates that are difficult to scale up for organizations that are working on a shoestring and have been doing a lot. So that's I know I've packed a lot in there to your answer, but I think part of it is natural injury for the addiction. I think it's going to be absorbing the money and figuring out how to spend it in the right way. And then I think the polling comes down to culture and pride and self-sufficiency in rural America. So.
And I really, and there again is an important point of nuance. I can take you to a lot of blue rural counties, and they're going to have large black populations in Mississippi. So looking at the voting patterns by race, again, you know, that is an important part of any dialogue that we should be in as we're focusing on solutions. I agree completely with your comment about massive federal investment, and so I'm going to share a letter with you that was written to us by a grocery store owner who was able to open a grocery in a town of 960 people, only because there was subsidy, only because there was a CDFI that was able to be there. He wrote this to us on Thanksgiving. He said, "First off, let me apologize for my delayed response here, but things have been hectic. Today's the first day off I've had in a month, so I would like to take a few moments now that I am able to let you all know the role that you played. It's actually much bigger than a grocery store. The residents of Gloucester and the surrounding areas were having to drive 45 minutes to an hour to achieve what they have now, fresh food at a healthy price. I've been hugged, prayed over, thanked, and cried on for the last several weeks, and while I understood the need here, I had no idea just how bad the conditions were until opening. One moment stands out more than any other was when a customer came to me and said, 'Bless you, We haven't felt like human beings for years, and now we do. That was only made possible because we had the subsidy to make it work. It was only possible because the rural people in that town voted for a tax incentive to put it in place, and because they shop there every day, and because an operator is willing to make it happen.
Well, thank you. We might have time for one more question. Nope, we have no more time for questions. Oh, they just said no. Katrina's on her way up. So I would like to ask everybody to thank this wonderful panel. This was great. And as we go, Katrina is going to transition us, but I think we thank you very much.
So as they're walking off the stage, I want to grab your attention for just a couple minutes before we take a quick break. First, just wanted to say good morning to those I haven't seen yet this morning. If I haven't gotten a chance to meet you yet, I'm Katrina Badger. I'm a program officer at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and one of my key roles there is to help bridge across our relationships, investments, and strategies related to rural. So really pleased to have you all here today, and I'm really excited to hear the conversations that are unfolding. I wanted to share that as we think about the way that we want to show up as Robert Wood Johnson Foundation in this space and how we hope to show up as partners, I actually think that the way that the event today is laid out demonstrates our different ways of showing up quite nicely, and so wanted to bring that to life for you a little bit, both related to our role in building the evidence and research, as you've heard this morning, also our commitment to communications, as you'll hear in the next hour and forward, and then what's incredibly important to us is the relationships and networks and ways that we can support folks doing this work to advance health and opportunity in rural communities across the country. So wanted to just make that visible to the rest of you, as that really is an important part of how this event has actually been an important partnership across the whole foundation with our research team, our communications team, and our program teams across the foundation. I wanted to also note that we see convening as an important role that we can play and bringing folks together. So while we don't have deep expertise in rural, we recognize the expertise and knowledge that all of you bring and the value of having you all here together with us. And so we wanted to build in the time after a very long and heavy day of conversation to create the space from 2:30 to 4 for you all to identify the topics and discussions that you think are most important to be having and to have us be able to listen and participate in those conversations. So we hope that during the break today and throughout, at least through the end of lunch, that you'll bring ideas for the kinds of discussions you want to have for that afternoon session and write them on the flip chart in the back of the room. Note your name if you're willing to host that conversation and be the conversation starter. And then at the end, at 2:30, we'll share the different discussions that we'll create the space for. And we're really excited about joining those conversations, both to listen and learn and also just to be a true participant with you all. With that, I think we'll take a quick break. We'll have about 10 minutes, but hopefully you'll get back in your seats quickly so we can hear from Sarah and Ken. And for those online, I think we're planning to start back up at 10:45. Thank you.